The year 2016, NASA described it as the warmest year on the Earth's surface since modern record keeping began in 1880. While barometers were rising high, tensions also rose in several parts of the world. The Syrian refugee crisis, Brexit, multiple terrorist attacks across Europe, events which impacted our industry. And while we thought that the worst was behind us, 2017 was off not to such a good start. Decisions which could probably have an impact on both business and leisure travel. And while the Western travel markets go through a lot of roller coasters and there remains a lot of uncertainty, we decided to do a quick poll among European travelers to see their intent to travel to the US in the light of recent events. And surprisingly, the results were not so good. Anywhere between a fifth to a third of European travelers are now indicating that they are less likely to travel to the US. So where does that put APAC in the whole scene? While not entirely insulated from global events, APAC still is on a relatively sound footing. To begin with, APAC is still the world's biggest travel market in terms of gross bookings, far ahead of Europe and slightly ahead of US. Its online travel market, while underpenetrated, still young, continues to grow more than 2 times its peers in the form of US and Europe. Next up, the economy. A lot of people in the industry tend to relate GDP growth to the potential of the travel market. By all means, it's right, but it is truly not the only indicator. On this slide, for example, while China and India are on the extreme end of the spectrum, the reality is far from different when it comes to travel market potential. Already, China is the world's second biggest travel market after the US, and India recently overtook Australia and New Zealand as the third biggest travel market in APAC. And with faster growing economies, employment rising, and rising disposable income in the hands of consumers, travel is also coming up in order when it comes to discretionary spend. We've been doing consumer surveys across APAC for better part of 1.5 years, and while domestic travel still holds strong in most of the markets, we're seeing that increasingly travelers are going beyond borders. In markets such as Australia, Malaysia, China, almost 1 in 2 travelers went overseas for their last leisure trip, and the figure is slightly less in other parts of the region. And these figures somehow even compare to travel trends in Europe and US, wherein either 1 in 2 travelers traveled overseas or 4 in 10 as well. Next up, you cannot have a conversation about APAC travel market without touching about the mobile travel revolution. APAC is truly the world's most dynamic mobile travel market, and China by far is leading the race. China is world's first mobile majority online travel market, with over 50% of its online gross bookings being done on mobile. And who are behind these revolutions? It's primarily the intermediaries. Aggregate across APAC, 55% of all mobile bookings went through intermediary platforms. In India, 86% of mobile bookings were powered by OTAs. So we at Phocuswright have been covering the travel startup ecosystem for a few years, and it's a peeve project of myself. Since 2005, global travel startup funding hit cumulatively $48 billion in 2016, $35 billion of which were raised in the last 2 years alone. And we've tracked 1,500 startups across the world and evaluated their publicly disclosed funding, and APAC now accounts for half of all the global travel startup funding. Looking closely at APAC, it now accounts for 30% of all global travel startup, 50% of all funding, But within APAC, China and India are miles ahead when it comes to rest of the countries. These China and India particularly are hotbeds for travel innovation and also investors pooling in their capital and confidence behind the entrepreneurs. In terms of funding, China accounted for over 80% of all funding into the travel industry. So with access to capital, startups, or at least some of them, are creating a landscape similar to this slide. Startups are fierce and hungry to gain share. Incumbents, big, strong, and all ready to defend their turf. But in order to distinguish themselves, most of the startups are actually pursuing emerging new online travel segments: on-demand transportation, private accommodation, in-destination activities, budget hotel aggregation. And all of these segments we will be touching upon on center stage over the next 24 hours. Within some of these segments, we've already seen consolidation, and most striking being the recent merger of Uber's China business into Didi on the private accommodation, and Tujia acquiring rival Mai and also taking over private accommodation businesses of both Ctrip and Qunar. Tours and activities, we recently concluded a global study on the segment, and it is now the world's third largest travel segment with $129 billion in gross bookings, and APAC accounting for close to a third of it. Budget hotels, who here isn't happy that someone has finally taken the step to give a facelift to the much needed facelift to the long tail of budget hotels? Continuing on the conversation of consolidation, APAC brands really stepped up their M&A game over the last year, with Chinese OTAs particularly showing to the world that they have global ambitions. And no conversation about consolidation would be over without touching upon MakeMyTrip's recent merger with Ibibo Group. Together, they are the largest online travel company in India, and their stable of brands are more than a dozen, which ensures that they have multiple touch points to get to the consumer. And also, the question one begs to ask, is MakeMyTrip India's answer to Ctrip? To conclude, APAC is home to some of the fastest growing economies with rising disposable income. People are traveling more, travelers want to do more, see more. APAC countries and companies are trailblazers when it comes to mobile app distribution and consumer uptake of the mobile solutions. Funding accelerates, startups explode, digital adoption rising. And finally, consolidation is all about capturing scale, be it product, tech, or customer. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Phocuswright India conference, and this is the Asian Advantage.